weight is coming from fat and that we're not losing muscle. And we'll talk about why that is important here in a second. But if you look at these two individuals here, this picture I have here, you can see that both of these people are the same height and weight. They're both about 180 centimeters, and they both weigh about 100 kilos. So you can see, though, that even though these people are the same height and the same weight, they look very different. Right? The guy on the left clearly has more muscle, and the guy on the right clearly has more fat. Okay? So you can see that if these two people got on the scales, they would weigh exactly the same. You get the same piece of information, but clearly they're very different. Right? So what's the primary difference? The primary difference is the relative proportion of fat and muscle that each one of these individuals has. So if you look at the guy on the left has only 5% fat, whereas the guy on the right has 30% fat. Now, that's really important because there's a certain consequence of having a lot of muscle. And the consequence of having a lot of muscle is you burn a lot of calories. And this is important. If you look at the basal metabolic rate, which is just the amount of calories that these people are burning at rest. So in a 24-hour period, if they would just sit there and not do anything, you can see that the bodybuilder would burn about 2,400 calories, while the other guy, the sedentary guy, would burn only about 19. So there's a significant difference, right? 540 calories, roughly, difference between the amount of calories the bodybuilder is burning and the amount of calories the sedentary guy. And this is important because when you want to lose weight, the only thing that will lead to weight loss is being in a calorie deficit. You have to burn more calories than you eat. So clearly, if you can burn 550 more calories at rest doing nothing, it's going to be much easier to put you in a calorie deficit. So this is why measuring body composition is so important. So you've often heard that muscle weighs more than fat. And what people mean when they say that is that muscle takes up less space than fat at the same weight. Another way of saying that is the density of fat and muscle are different. So if you look at the density of fat at 0.9 kilos per hour and the density of muscle at 1.6 kilos, essentially means that for any given volume of muscle or fat, the muscle will weigh more, right, at that given volume. So what we can see here is that at any given weight, when this weight is the same, we have roughly 2 kilos of fat and 2 kilos of muscle, which is about 5 pounds. You can see that the fat takes up more space, okay? And this is, again, really important because there's a difference, aesthetically, there's a difference between losing fat and losing water or losing muscle, right? One thing to note is that the faster you lose weight, the more likely that loss is to come from muscle, right? So when weight loss is really, really fast, you're generally losing water or muscle or both. You're not losing fat. Now, a lot of people will be discouraged if they say, well, I only lost 2 kilos of fat, or I only lost 2 kilos of weight, because when people see 2 kilos on the scale, they don't consider that to be very significant. And if you lost 2 kilos from water, you really wouldn't see that on your body, right? It just doesn't take up much space. But fat, if you lose 2 kilos of fat, you can see what this is going on you, right? So this is anatomically correct what 2.3 kilos of fat. And you can see that when you lose weight just from fat, there are significant improvements in the weight, right? So this is another reason why body composition is so important, because if all we're looking at is weight, and we see, oh, well, I did this for 4 months, and I only lost 2 kilos, most people would be discouraged by that. But if they did that, and that weight came purely from fat, then you would definitely see those differences, and they would be more happy. Now I want to talk about what happens when you go on a crash diet. And this is a bit of a complicated graph here. So this graph comes from a study called the Minnesota Starvation Study. It's a very famous study that was done in the United States some years ago, where they took military recruits And they basically put them on a semi-starvation diet for 6 months. So what I mean by semi-starvation is they calculated how many calories the individuals needed to stay weight stable, not lose, not gain. So what do they normally eat? And once they figured that out, they decreased that by 50%. So they decreased the caloric intake by 50%, and they held them there for 6 months. And then at the end of that 6 months, they allowed the individuals to eat back as much as they wanted. And then they basically looked at what happened to fat and muscle and caloric intake over that time. So what I'm going to show here is the same thing, what happens to calorie intake, muscle mass, and fat mass over the 6 months of starvation and then the 5 months of refeeding, okay? Now you'll see here on the y-axis you have baseline values, and this green line, the green dotted line, basically represents the starting values for the things that we're looking at, for fat, muscle, and calories. So let's look at calories first. So as we said, this is their starting point. This is what they were normally eating, and the investigators decreased their calorie intake by 50%, and then held them there for 6 months. So at the end of the 6 months, which is right at this period here, they told the individuals, okay, go back and eat as much as you want. And you can see what happens. You can see that there's a dramatic increase in caloric intake. There's a dramatic increase in caloric intake, and you can see that caloric intake here can go up to about 180% of the starting value, right? So they're overeating. They're eating almost double what they did before this study started. And that's not surprising, right? If you basically starve somebody for 6 months and then say you can eat whatever you want, they're probably going to overeat. So let's look at what happens to fat over that period. So this red line represents fat mass, and you can see that, as you would expect, over the 6 months of starvation, you have a significant decrease in fat. Fat drops quite a bit. And then when you start feeding these individuals back, as you would expect, fat mass starts to return back to normal. Now, one thing you'll notice is that this is the point where the fat mass returns back to its baseline value, okay? But at that point, you'll notice that the caloric intake is still quite a bit above what it needs to be. Caloric intake is about 30 to 40% higher, even though the fat mass has returned back to its baseline value. Now, you may have heard about the set point theory of weight management. The set point theory basically says that the body wants to stay at some given weight. And when you try and deviate from that, it'll try really hard to get back to that. So here, our fat weight is back to normal, but our caloric intake is still much higher than it needs to be, right? So you'll notice that because this fat is back to normal and the caloric intake is still elevated, as long as the caloric intake is still elevated, they're going to be in a calorie surplus and they're going to keep gaining fat. And that's what happens. You see this increase in fat that continues over time, and this is called fat overshoot or collateral fat. Right? And you may have experienced this before, where you go on a diet, you lose a bunch of weight, and then you start eating again, and you gain more weight than you gain back more than you lost, right? That's because of this. So one of the things we need to consider is what happens to muscle mass during that same time. So the blue line represents muscle mass. You can see that there's a significant drop in muscle mass over the 6 months of starvation. And then they start refeeding the people back, and eventually the muscle mass gets back to normal. And you'll notice that the caloric intake drops down to normal when the muscle mass returns to its baseline value. Okay? So the question then is the drop in muscle the thing that is driving the overeating? So because it's probably not the drop in fat, because when the fat comes back to normal, your caloric intake is still elevated. When the muscle comes back to normal, the caloric intake normalizes back down to its pre-tested value. Okay, so the question then to ask is, can I prevent the excessive caloric intake if I can prevent the fall in muscle during the diet? And that's really the crux of the issue. Is can you prevent the loss of muscle? And the answer to that is yes. Muscle loss during dieting is absolutely avoidable. Now, I will tell you that as a general rule, when you look at weight loss research, most weight loss research where they will do dietary interventions or exercise interventions, you will see about 20 to 30% of the weight loss coming from muscle, which we just demonstrated is not a good thing. Right? Now, if you look at these various diet programs, you can see we have several options here. You have a very low calorie diet, a low carb diet, a low fat diet, a high protein diet, and a high fiber diet. And all of these have roughly a 75% of the weight loss coming from fat and around 25% of the weight loss coming from muscle. And as we said, 20 to 30% of the total weight loss coming from muscle is considered normal during weight loss research. But if you look at the high protein diet, with the high protein diet, you only have 11% of the weight loss coming from muscle, and you have about 90% of the muscle loss coming from fat. So remember that all of these diets, there has to be a caloric deficit in order to lose fat. But only the high protein diet is able to prevent or mitigate the loss in muscle during that period of calorie deficit. Okay? And that is super important. Now, the other thing that I wanted to point out is that during a weight loss intervention, if you add a high protein intake and if you add weight training on top of that, you can completely prevent any loss in muscle during dieting. And in fact, you can actually increase your muscles during a calorie deficit if you are adding high protein and doing resistance training. So that is incredibly important because one of the strongest predictors of weight regain following weight loss. So are you going to regain that weight after you lose it? One of the strongest predictors is how much of that weight comes from muscle. Because remember, muscle is a metabolic engine that burns calories. Fat burns very few calories. So if you have a pound of fat on you, that burns very, very few calories, right? But a pound of muscle, when you activate that pound of muscle, that's going to burn far more calories than that 1 pound of fat, right? So you don't want to take on a diet that's going to cause you to lose the very thing that burns the calories that you need to get rid of, right? So if you are taking on a dieting strategy and you find you are losing weight really, really quickly, it's probably coming from muscle. You should probably stop that and do something else. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the protein and calorie content. Because a lot of people have misconceptions about what good sources of protein are. So for example, a lot of people say peanut butter is a good source of protein. It's not a good source. It's a good source of fat that has some protein in it. Okay, so what I've taken here is you have your food on the left, and then you have the calories, the protein, and the calorie to protein ratio, which is simply the number of calories divided by the grams of protein in that food. And if we look at peanut butter, you can see the calorie to protein ratio is 24. And these are all normalized at 18 grams of protein. So you'll see that for 18 grams of protein coming from peanut butter, that's going to give you 24 calories for each gram of protein that you're eating. Now, if you look at egg whites only have 86 calories for 18 grams of protein, and as a result, the calorie to protein ratio is 5. So 86 divided by 18 is 5. So looking at the calorie to protein ratio is a very good way to tell you whether or not your food source is actually a good source of protein. Because, again, you can be fooled. If you look at peanut butter and say, oh, peanut butter has 18 grams, yeah, but it has 423 calories, right? So we may not know right off the top of our head how that math works and whether that's a good source of protein. If we divide the calories by the protein, we get the calorie to protein ratio. Now we have a much better idea of whether these things are considered good sources of protein. Okay? So the challenge then becomes, how do we make sure that we're eating enough protein while ensuring we stay in a calorie deficit, right? Because we know if we want to lose fat, we have to be in a calorie deficit. but we also want to make sure that we're eating enough protein so that we're not losing our muscle. Well, that's hard to do because usually protein sources are often high in fat. If you're eating a lot of animal protein, red meat, stuff like that, chicken with the skin on it, things like that, those things are going to give you a lot of protein, but they're going to come with a lot of fat. So we need to find a way to get lean protein. And one of the best ways to do that is with Neo-Life shakes. And we'll talk about why these are so good now. So I have the same chart here, the protein and calorie content in various foods, but here you'll notice that I have the Neo-Life shake here, both mixed with milk and mixed with water. You can see with water it's 18 grams, which is why I made everything else 18 grams of protein. So let's look at the Neo-Life shake mixed in water. And you can see that that has a protein to calorie ratio of only 8, which is quite close to the egg whites here, which is 5. So this is what this tells you is that this is a food that has a high protein content and a low calorie content, which is exactly what you want. So you may say, going forward, I'm only going to eat, when it comes to protein sources, I'm only going to eat protein sources that have a calorie to protein ratio of 10 and under. So that would mean you can eat things like skinless chicken breast, your Neo-Life shake mixed in either milk or water. Those things would allow you to stay under that 10 calorie to protein ratio, and will give you a good sort of guideline for knowing whether a food is a good source of protein. Let's talk a little more about the shake, what's inside. There's a proprietary protein blend in Neo-Life shakes, and protein blends are important because when we eat a protein, that protein breaks down into amino acids, and those amino acids go out into the blood. And those amino acids are now available for tissue repair and all the other things that proteins do. And protein is mainly involved with repair of tissue. It's not supposed to be used as fuel during exercise. So you'll see that Neo-Life shakes have, they're complete, meaning they have all the amino acids that you need to get through the diet. And because they're a protein blend, the protein absorbs at different rates through the gut. So whey protein, which comes from milk, is going to absorb much faster than soy protein, which comes from a plant. And that's good because that means that your amino acid profile in the blood is going to be elevated right away from the whey, but then it's going to take longer for those amino acids to come up in the blood because of the soy. So having a blend allows for amino acids to be elevated for a longer period of time, and that's a good thing. That allows the tissues to be able to have access to that protein to repair whenever it needs it. As I said, there's 18 grams of protein. There are also branched chain amino acids, which are good because branched chain amino acids can actually be metabolized by the muscle for fuel. So again, we don't really want dietary protein to be used as fuel because we want those proteins to be able to be available to the tissues for tissue resynthesis. But by providing these branched chain amino acids, the muscle is able to use those for energy so that during periods of like long exhaustive exercise and stuff like that, the muscles don't break down and get consumed. So it also has 5 grams of fiber, and fiber is very satisfying. It fills you up. And protein is very satisfying as well. So the combination of protein and fiber is very satisfying, which means you'll eat less throughout the day when you use these shakes. It has an ideal protein to carb to fat ratio, and I've said a few times that protein is not supposed to be used as fuel. Carbs and fat are your fuel. Protein are the building blocks that allow for tissue resynthesis and repair. It's important that you have both, or all three, protein, carbs, and fat, because carbs and fats are both fuels, but they're used during different times. So during periods of rest and low intensity exercise, you're primarily going to be burning fat. During high intensity exercise, you're primarily going to be burning carbs. So it's important that your food source has both of those things in there so that the body can switch between those fuel sources when it needs to. It only has 150 calories, so when it's mixed with water, So that meets that low calorie, high protein ratio. Even when it's mixed with milk, it still meets that high protein, low calorie ratio. It also has a lot of vitamins and minerals, other good stuff like that, micronutrients. I want to briefly talk about a study that was done looking at Neo-Life shakes. This was a 12-week study of overweight and obese individuals, and all they did was replace 2 of their meals with Neo-Life shakes. They did no other dietary or exercise intervention. So the only behavior modification was drink a shake for breakfast, drink a shake for lunch, and don't take any big changes. And at the end of that study, the subjects lost an average of about 2.5 kilos. The BMI decreased from 29.7 to 29.2. Their hip circumference decreased by 2 centimeters. And they also had some improvements in their blood markers. So this is important because this is low-hanging fruit. These are things that are easy to incorporate. Roberto mentioned at the beginning of this, we're going into the new year, we're all looking for things to change. The best way to have, or a very good way to have a lasting change is to incorporate a behavior that's easy to incorporate. And it's something, this is very easy to incorporate. So maybe you don't eat breakfast at all, maybe you wake up and you just drink coffee. If you drink a Neo-Life shake, it's going to fill you up. You're going to eat less throughout the day. And if you drink these things earlier in the day, 1 for breakfast, 1 for lunch, the combination, if you drink 1 for breakfast, 1 for lunch, just from the powder alone, you're looking at 36 grams of protein and 10 grams of fiber. That is going to fill you up throughout the day. You will eat less. You will eat less throughout the day. You will eat less at dinner. And as a result of that, it's very common for people who undertake this regimen to lose fat weight. Not water weight, fat weight, because you're actually increasing the amount of protein that you're eating while you're decreasing the calories. Okay? So that combination is very good at allowing for fat loss while we're eating. These are some supporting products. Botanical balance helps to support healthy glucose levels in the body. Whenever we diet or when we're eating low intake, there's a chance that we run the risk that we're going to have insulin spikes and glucose fluctuations and things like that. And this balances that out. The Neo-Life bar provides 10 grams of protein, 5 grams of fiber, so this is also another really good snack option during the day. You don't have to mix it with anything, it's very portable. They're not chocolate, so they don't melt all over the place. You can keep them in hot places, so these are really convenient products to use as well. Then finally, Neo-Life tea can help with some of the cognitive issues that often happen when they're eating low calorie. Sometimes you get brain fog and things like that. Neo-Life tea can help improve mental clarity. I believe that is all I have. I know I went a little quick there, but I know Roberto had some questions.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Miller. Thank you.